I will launch into discussing a couple of the ingredients, if you will, for LANDFIRE's vegetation departure. And then I will continue on to talk about LANDFIRE's reference conditions and how we modeled that. And for both presentations, I will ground us in a bit of a flow chart. And yeah, again, happy to take questions at the end, and Corey and Sarah and others can fill in blanks in the chat as needed. Then also, before I open up my PowerPoints and I go into ArcGIS Pro and then into SynchroSim, I've made efforts to try to be accessible and make sure my presentations are easy to see. But if for any reason at all, I don't get it right the first time and you have any difficulty understanding what I say or present, please reach out and we'll do everything we can to help. Again, doing it right the first time is best, but if we don't, please reach out. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen. And as you're looking at this map, I am going to tell a quick anecdote. All right, so is everyone seeing my PowerPoint? And I can't see the chat, so maybe somebody can. Okay, great. All right, so the quick anecdote. When I started with the Nature Conservancy a good while back, my first job was as a forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's Michigan chapter. And my job essentially was as I call a landscape ecologist / social worker. My job was to help the large industrial forest products producers such as Mead, International Paper, and others, share appropriate data and management ideas with each other, and to also coordinate with the state forest managers, the DNR in Michigan, it's the Department of Natural Resources, and with the national forests. And because of antitrust laws and many other reasons, it was really hard because we did not have wall-to-wall data. And that's when I first learned about LANDFIRE. And I got super, super excited because this wall-to-wall data. Further, we needed data that described what was on the landscapes prior to European colonization. And as you probably know, there have been multiple efforts over time to do this. LANDFIRE is not the first, for sure. I'll describe some of those efforts in my presentation, but it was, again, wall to wall. It did not stop at state boundaries, for example. And I've always been taken with this data set, even though it's definitely not perfect. So I'm going to be talking about LANDFIRE's ecosystem extent data set, officially known as biophysical settings. So first, I'm going to go over that flow chart that I mentioned. I'm going to give you a super brief definition of biophysical settings, which I'll probably refer to as BPSs. I'll put it in context to a few other similar data sets and would love to see the chatter go off the wall with that because I will not be complete. I'll touch on some challenges with the BPS data. Jim mentioned one earlier around map zones. And then I'm going to dig into ArcGIS Pro to explore the data and attribute table a little bit more. You may be wondering why I have this kind of picture here. It looks super gnarly, and it is. I show this picture. It's of a northern hardwoods area near Picture Rocks National Lake Shore here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I live. As I mentioned earlier, the northern hardwoods are, the sugar maples, the beeches, yellow birch, white pine, hemlock, these mesophytic tree species typically that are not adapted to fire for the most part, though our knowledge of that is changing all the time. Also, most people, when they think of northern hardwoods, think of, tall trees, closed canopy, that sort of thing. And I show this is northern hardwoods here, post major, almost apocalyptic windstorm. And at the far distance of the picture is a cliff that drops right into Lake Superior. So the winds get gnarly here. And this is still northern hardwoods, even though it's been decimated by wind. And one of the beautiful things to me about LANDFIRE biophysical settings is that they are systems. So they incorporate, the early succession, the post-disturbance, the late succession, and everything in between of the system. So it's not just you know, a habitat type per se. So here's a flow chart. This came out of a paper that our team published in 2021. We'll share that chat out later. Oh, all right. I just saw the chat pop up. I couldn't help it. Take a quick look. Yeah, so there's a paper about the vegetation departure data set use and customization of that is in the journal Lands that we'll share out. And on the left, you see basically 4 inputs. We have the reference condition models, the ecosystem extent, which is what I'll be talking about now, the summary unit, which for LANDFIRE would be map zones that Jim touched on, and I'll go into maybe more than you want in a little bit. And then to capture current conditions, we have our structural stages or succession class data. So basically, in LANDFIRE's work in vegetation departure, we do a spatial combine of those bottom 3 inputs to calculate current percent. Then the reference percents come from the biophysical settings models. So that's our kind of grounding flow chart, I hope. And I'll here be talking about the biophysical settings. All right. Okay, so here's the basic text slide. LANDFIRE's biophysical settings data depicts where ecosystems would have been historically, that is just prior to European colonization, based on many abiotic factors and an approximation of historical disturbance regimes. So I'll describe, in the next slide, I'll give a visual of this and go into it more for sure. The original list of ecological systems that we worked with came from NatureServe. And as you'll learn, we did modify that list a bit as we went through the process. And there is some stratification by map zones. Also, importantly, each biophysical setting you know, is represented spatially in the biophysical settings spatial data set. Also is accompanied by a text description and a state and transition model. So it's really, it's a bundle of information, literally, that I think can be very useful. All right, so again, at the top is that text description, and I'm going to walk through these maps a little bit and dig into this data set called environmental site potential first. So LANDFIRE developed a data set called environmental site potential as largely as a precursor in the processing to get to the biophysical settings data. It's you can read it very literally. It depicts what would happen on a site based on the abiotic conditions, the slope, elevation aspect, climate, soil, superficial geology, that sort of thing. And in my mind, it's artificial, and it's sort of looking at almost a climax situation. So very simply, for a site, you might have an oak forest in an environmental site potential. All right, so lock that into your mind for a moment. Then what LANDFIRE did is sort of, I'll use the word adjust or calibrated the environmental site potential based on outputs from our biophysical settings models. Also, there's a refinement in the legend. So I'll go through a couple examples. In the bottom of the 2 maps, on the environmental site potential map on the left in kind of the sky blue would be northern hardwoods. Again, that set of mesophytic trees I mentioned earlier that's not known as being fire adapted. When we basically adjusted the biophysical settings data based on disturbance regimes, a lot of those pixels that were once northern hardwoods in the environmental site potential data set were transferred or reclassified, would probably be a better term, as northern pine oak, the northern pine oak biophysical setting, which is very fire adapted. So this landscape in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan, not far from where I live, was very fire adapted in places. And the biophysical settings data tried to get at that with that refinement. Also, you'll notice at the top, there's a change from the pink jack pine black spruce environmental site potential type to the pine barrens light green type. So what happened there specifically is that when we got our legend or list of ecosystems from NatureServe, the jack pines, a super important species in the Upper Peninsula and in the Great Lakes, was represented in only one ecological system, that jack pine black spruce. And in our part of the world, that just does not capture the variability and sort of where jack pines occur. And because of management for wildlife, for timber products, all sorts, and wildfire management, experts split that jack pine black spruce type out into multiple types, including pine barrens. So that change that you see in the biophysical settings data to light green from pink represents more a refinement of the legend. So there's refinement by disturbances and refinement by the legend as we basically transition from the environmental site potential input data set to biophysical settings. I wanted to drill into this a fair bit because I see people using environmental site potential, especially in peer-reviewed literature, when I think they were probably really trying to get at biophysical settings. We do deliver environmental site potential and it can be useful, but if you want to think about disturbances and or you want to connect the data to our models or descriptions, or if you're calculating vegetation departure, you would definitely be looking at the biophysical settings data. So there are many similar data sets that try to depict some version of potential veg or historical veg. One that I found, this specific example was new to me. There are many interpretations of General Land Office survey notes. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, the General Land Office, government agency that sent people out to survey the United States and set up our grid of basically political boundaries and ownership. And as they did that work, they had corners and they noted what trees were on those corners and where they put markers. And then they took notes in between. And many geographers and ecologists have interpreted those notes and made maps, such as this one that we see for a small area in Texas. These maps also exist in many other parts of the country. There's a great one in Michigan. There's one for Wisconsin. And I think a couple of takeaways from that is they're super useful. If you dig into the literature, you'll find both arguments about bias in this data set and ways to correct the bias. More importantly for us, though, I think is that they are truly a snapshot of when the surveyors walk through that area. And to me, they're a little bit more of a cover type. So in the Great Lakes, there might be a polygon of aspen birch. Aspen birch in my part of the world is a precursor, a pioneer kind of succession class for many ecosystems. So based on soils, climate, that sort of thing, that aspen birch could stay aspen birch and just cycle through based on disturbance, or it could transition to oaks, pines, or even northern hardwoods. So super useful data set, but different from LANDFIRE's biophysical settings in that it's really a snapshot and represents one portion of an ecosystem's development. Habitat typing is another sort of classification system that tries to get at potential veg by making the connection between, in John Kotar's work specifically, soil conditions, so soil fertility and drainage, and understory plants. This can be super useful for forest management because the overstory trees may change. There may be a conversion that has happened through management, but the understory plants hypothetically will reflect what's in the soil. Then we're going to dig into Ecozones and the Forest Service Terrestrial Ecological Unit Inventory, otherwise known as TUI, in the next couple of slides. So Ecozones, I've got an example map from Western Maryland, or the headwaters of the Potomac River. And so basically Steve Simone, in collaboration with others through the years, has done tons of field work, brought tons of expert knowledge and sort of statistical analyses to bear to map ecozones, which are units of land that can support a specific plant community or plant community group. based on environmental factors such as temperature, moisture, fertility, topography, etc. So very, very, very similar to LANDFIRE's biophysical settings. And as we'll hear tomorrow, people are using this as their sort of ecological footprint, if you will, and calculating vegetation departure in the Appalachian areas. All right, so Lisa Klusner will be digging much more into the TUI, or the Terrestrial Ecosystem Units Inventory, tomorrow, but this is one representation of that. On the right is sort of a locator map of the Shawnee National Forest. And then the bigger map would be land type associations. And Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe you said that these are 10,000s to 100s of thousands of acres. And other Forest Service people, please correct me. So this is one level in a very hierarchical system. They're polygons, again, based on a lot of the same factors that I mentioned with Ecozones and with biophysical settings. So Lisa has worked hard to basically implement one level of their TUI in calculating vegetation departure for the Wayne National Forest, and we're working to do that in other locations across the East. So I'm going to zoom in on a couple static maps just for the fun of it, so you can see what the data looks like. This is the Hiawatha National Forest proclamation boundary in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And you'll notice just the sort of the layout of this landscape. And what I've done here are mapped the top 10 most prevalent biophysical settings. So you're going to see some white or light green areas where I pulled out some of the less represented types. And you'll notice that we have the purples. Those purples are the alkaline conifer hardwood swamp in the light purple or lavender. And then the darker purple would be the boreal acidic peatlands. And just a note, I mentioned some challenges. LANDFIRE, from what I've gleaned over the years, maps where wet areas are well. But in terms of teasing apart those types, we're not great at it. It would require really good soil pH data, from what I've learned, to separate out these types. And it is incredible. I remember bringing in LANDFIRE mappers to the Upper Peninsula back in the day, and we walked a mile, and we went from Laurentian alkaline conifer hardwood swamp, boreal acidic peatland, to northern hardwoods, to jack pines, like in a mile. And there was very little elevation slope aspect, so the mappers from Montana were flummoxed at this. So we did adjust the mapping methods to base our work more on soils and that sort of thing. So extremely challenging work. And I think that we get pretty good reviews on this, except for that wetlands challenge in my part of the world. A similar looking map for the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. Again, this is mapping, the top most prevalent biophysical settings for that area. And it just gives you a flavor for the detail and how these things play out across the landscape. Then I believe I have one more. This is in Arizona. This is map zone 15. Some work I did for collaborators there. And you can see the patterning of the ecosystems and this biophysical settings data there as well. And there, a lot of topography to base biophysical settings mapping on. And I'm trusting that people looks like the chat's going well. I am not going to stop to look at that, but thank you for that. I can't wait to see what you guys are talking about in a moment. So we're going to drill into this map zone thing a fair bit. Some of you on the call might be shaking your head because they can represent both an opportunity and a challenge. So these map zones, which are represented in the light gray lines on this map, are basically national land cover data set polygons. And in my mind, this is not official terminology, but in my mind, they were sort of the original biophysical settings data delivery polygons, or a way to stratify things. And what I'm showing here is a sage steppe biophysical setting in the northwestern portion of the country. And you see that each different variant, the orange, the purple or light purple, and green, stretch across multiple map zones. And you'll notice, as I mentioned, that there are 3 variants. And so, as Jim mentioned, the variants have the same reference conditions. And talking to Corey about this a little bit, it sounded like, in general, in broad terms, the variants make sense geographically, and Corey can dig into that more via the chat or in her presentation. But in this area, they sort of make sense. They don't always make sense. Sometimes it was based on who was available to do the modeling and where we had expertise. So I just wanted to kind of call that out to you. And to summarize, before getting into ArcGIS Pro and looking at some of the data, you know, an ecosystem extent or footprint data set is required for vegetation departure. In LANDFIRE, we use biophysical settings, but other people are using other data sets, such as Ecozones and the Appalachians, the different layers of the terrestrial ecosystem units inventoried by the Forest Service, and other data sets as well. So you need a footprint, and in LANDFIRE, we use biophysical settings. I don't know if you can hear the love in my voice, but I think the biophysical settings data is amazing. It's definitely not perfect. So when we talk about scale, you know, another thing that we need to consider is how the data is designed to be used. The rasters are delivered as 30 meter by 30 meter raster data sets. The pixels are 30 meters by 30 meters, but it's not meant to be used pixel by pixel. The data sets were definitely designed to be used across large landscapes. And for the Upper Peninsula, you know, the wetlands are a super dominant part of our landscape, and we're having to work to, you know, either improve the wetlands data or stamp in something else, because we just didn't do a great job of teasing out 2 dominant wetland types. So that definitely happens. So with that, I wanted to pause a second and see if there are any clarifying questions before I go into ArcGIS Pro.
I think everyone really appreciated that little kitty map. Thank you.
I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. I just see animals and landscapes all the time. I'm just gonna dig into a couple of questions I see really quick. So Louis, great questions. Louis asked, assuming that the pine barrens are made only of jack pine. In that slide, I simplified that name, and we have multiple pine barrens and pine oak barrens biophysical settings in the Great Lakes. So that, hopefully that helps with that. And Sarah,
there's a follow-up question after that. Yeah, there's a follow-up question. That's the one I was most interested in.
The jack pine black spruce is definitely a no. That is not the case. There is a separate jack pine black spruce biophysical setting that's standalone, and it is fire adapted as well. And I will say that, you know, I think a lot of those fires in Canada this summer, for example, occurred in the jack pine black spruce. But Louis, that's your world, not mine. But definitely, that jack pine black spruce is its own biophysical setting, and it is fire driven.
You see the difficulty of for biophysical modeling, that if you add fire to a system that essentially was fire suppressed, then you obtain this other system. And in terms of state transition modeling, that is just a class of a system. So you would not think the way it was, you know, you're just adding fire to the environmental settings, whatever methodology framework. You would think that the biophysical setting doesn't change just by adding the fire to it. You just have a fire suppressed class of the original biophysical. And that's what threw me off in the example, is that the way it's presented, unless there's more to it, is that you have the impression that jack pine black spruce is just a fire suppressed class of the pine barren system, but you're saying it's not. So
it's not.
Yeah, the soil must be different. Either they made a gross error initially and they just didn't know, and just adding fire to it doesn't solve your problem. Is that there is a misclassification in terms of the physical variables, not the fire at the very origin. And but I don't know if that's the case now. This is where it gets really tricky with biophysical settings, because you don't know who came first, you know.
Yeah, great question and clarification, Louis. So with that black spruce jack pine, and what I'm oversimplifying the name of black spruce or pine barrens, those two biophysical settings, there is a soils or abiotic difference between the two and fire regime differences between the two, even though they're both fire adapted biophysical settings. Another example of that I'll go into is I mentioned that, and I failed, I realize now, to follow up on a comment I made about the environmental site potential data. Right, so I mentioned that in environmental site potential data, you might have a pixel that would be oak forest, again, simplifying the name. In biophysical settings, that pixel might be labeled as oak savanna. That oak savanna biophysical setting might have, and likely does have, an oak forest succession class. So there's just conceptual and ecological overlap happening, and it's trying to put nature into boxes. And as Louis said, it's really challenging and can be really confusing. I saw recently a paper where the authors mapped potential prairie areas in the eastern United States using the biophysical settings data. And they did a great job at exploring that. And they basically pulled out biophysical settings that were prairie types. What they didn't do, and I don't blame them for this, is that they did not also pull out succession classes that were prairie within other biophysical settings. So for a more complete sort of analysis of the potential prairie area in the eastern United States, you would not only need to look at the prairie biophysical settings, but sort of fold in an accounting of how much potential of other biophysical settings could be prairie. So it takes a while to get your head around all of this. So Louis, thanks for that. And Anna, I see a question that I honestly don't think I know the answer to, and it's a good one. I wonder if Corey or Sarah or others.
I could add something here because we ran into this in Alaska, and it's a really great question, and it gets to this, issue in ecology of ecotones and where you draw the boundaries. So the question is about mapping at the land-sea interface, and do you include intertidal systems, for example, seagrass within a single BpS dynamic, or do you cut it off at the high tide mark? So in LANDFIRE, we said that if it's submerged or sometimes submerged, that's aquatic, and we're not mapping or modeling aquatic systems. We're only mapping and modeling terrestrial ecosystems. And so it's hard to draw that line in nature because there's this interplay back and forth and some flux. But I could point you to some descriptions for beach type systems in Alaska where we kind of address that issue. The other place we ran into it in Alaska is with kind of marsh fin bog systems where there's this dynamic interplay and some back and forth between terrestrial and aquatic. And again, we said if it's submerged vegetation, if we're mapping it as submerged vegetation today, we're not modeling that. So it kind of makes your succession dynamics a little tricky to model sometimes, or a little artificial, but I hope that helps. And I could point you to some specific models and descriptions to look at, Anna, if you want to dig into it further.
Thanks, Corey. It's something we've been grappling with as well. So I totally understand you don't have a solution yet. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for the great questions and for the assist on that, Corey. What I'm going to do now is go into ArcGIS Pro, and you might notice that I'm bleeding over in time to, into my reference conditions, and I'm fine with that. So if you're just jumping on, you're going to hear the tail end of the biophysical settings conversation, and then I'll go into reference conditions. So with that, off to ArcGIS Pro. So this again is the biophysical settings data as delivered by LANDFIRE. A couple notes about that. One, Sarah Hagen on our team has worked hard to develop a more accessible legend that's both attractive and again, more accessible. So we ran into some challenges implementing that yesterday, and I apologize for that. But, our team is really, under Sarah's leadership, trying to do what we can to be more accessible. So please reach out to us if interested in that. And Sarah also has a video on making maps such as ones with the biophysical settings data more universally sort of accessible for people. I also wanted to point out that this map represents, over 900 biophysical settings. So it's really incredible to me that we have that level of mapping. And as I'll dig into the attribute table, sometimes you might want to do some lumping depending on what your goals are. I mentioned map zones earlier, and here they are. And I've got the map zones kind of in the background in sort of a light green, bounded by gray lines, and you'll see the map zone numbers. And I'm going to zoom in to, again, I'm sorry, I'm focusing on Michigan, but it's just a really illustrative example that you just have to be aware of. If I were doing work, say, for the Michigan chapter of the Nature Conservancy or the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and maybe I'm writing a state wildlife action plan, and I go to download data and I'm looking at the biophysical settings data, I'm going to notice some funny things. I'm going to notice in my list of biophysical settings, I've got, maybe some duplicates, because Michigan occurs in map zone 50, mostly map zone 51, but also has a piece of map zone 49 and a piece of map zone 52. So you have to be aware of this when working with the biophysical settings data. And then down in Ohio, here's a convergence of 4 map zones. So partners in Ohio have been doing, these assessments over 17 counties, which is kind of an area in the sort of the southeastern part of Ohio, and they have been kind of caught in this map zone convergence. So I'll show you a little bit more about how that plays out, but we would be remiss not to highlight this for you. Then here's what it looks like when you sort of, overlay the map zone lines with the biophysical settings. And in some areas, it works out kind of okay. The edge effects can be abrupt, but you have to remember that the biophysical settings mapping and modeling and describing was done for an entire map zone. So you see map zone lines that can be tough to deal with. For example, if we look in southern Wisconsin, Illinois interface here, I do not believe that line is ecological. You may have had Matt and Linda do the describing, mapping, modeling here, and then, Sean and Louise did it here or here. So you end up with some different patterns. So with this, sort of to summarize, map zones are super important for you to be aware of. Sometimes they make ecological sense, sometimes they don't. And, the work was done for the whole map zone. So, I'm sure that if we look over here in this map zone in Eastern United States, that an ecosystem could have looked and worked historically differently in the north part of the mapping zone compared to the southern part. But our work was done across the whole map zone, averaging that. So again, reach out to us if you run into issues with this. We've dealt with it a lot. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to the Upper Peninsula again, where I live, and show you again sort of how things play out in terms of map zones. Sometimes it doesn't really make a huge difference, but here in this peninsula, we have actually a line that I have to work to reconcile when doing work for the Hiawatha National Forest in Michigan. So again, I'm probably over repeating this, but it's really important when we're working with these data sets. And then finally, to dig into that a little bit more in the Eastern United States, and then to go into the attribute table. For some reason, this is extremely slow to draw at the moment. This is going to be the Allegheny Dry Oak Forest and Woodland Biophysical Setting. And it goes from Pennsylvania down into northern Alabama. And you see those variants beginning to draw again, the green, the blue, the orange variants. And so if someone is working again in, say, Western West Virginia or in Ohio, they would have to be aware of these. So moving on from the map zone kind of repetition, I'm going to open up the attribute table and show you what that looks like for only this biophysical setting. All right, so I did an extract by attributes. BpS name equals Allegheny-Cumberland dry oak forest and woodland for this demo. So each biophysical setting, which when I say that, I'm kind of referring to as the name, has a corresponding number. The first 4 digits refer to the original ecological system. The last digit indicates whether that system was split or not. So in this example, NatureServe gave us a name and a description for Allegheny-Cumberland dry oak forest and woodland, and we did not split that up. I mentioned earlier the jack pine black spruce ecological system. We split that twice. So that number is like 13622, indicating it was split twice. We have the map zones in the attribute table. And then where we have identical reference conditions, we have this concatenation of the biophysical settings code and the map zones that have the identical reference conditions. So for this particular biophysical setting, we had map zones 57 and 61 have the same reference conditions. Map zone 62 is on its own, and map zones 48 and 53 have the same reference conditions. Then scrolling across an attribute table, we have a really broad lumping or grouping of the biophysical settings into, I believe, it's like 7 or 8 types. You would think I would know, but it's, you know, kind of the usual suspects: conifer, hardwood, riparian, and so on. So it's a broad grouping. So for the biophysical settings, we don't have a mid-level attribute. So sometimes I'll work with people and they will create their own kind of mid-level grouping attribute. Scrolling across, we have data that came from our biophysical settings models, which I'll be describing in a moment. We have the fire return interval, or the number of years that would pass between a fire on average passing a place. And it's the composite fire return interval for all the succession classes within a biophysical setting. So this oak forest and woodland may have a prairie succession class that would have had more frequent fire than, say, the oak forest, or possibly even a more mesophytic rare class within this oak forest and woodland that would have had a longer fire return interval. Then briefly, replacement fire would be top kill of greater than 75%. Surface fires for land fire meant top kill of less than 25%, and mixed is in between. Then we have the percent of those fire types for that biophysical setting. And then we have the last attribute that I will describe, which is the fire regime group. And I'll ask that Corey or Sarah, if you would, put a link to that fire regime group table in the chat. I don't have a graphic of that. The fire regime group captures severity and frequency into this fire regime group. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just pause for a second if there are any questions before I jump into reference condition modeling. And I see a hand, I believe. Hi.
Hi, Randy. Sorry, I can't find the hand thing, but I'll find it later.
No worries.
A quick question about, though, I was really interested in those horizontal connections between the biophysical models. You're talking about that hierarchy where you can group things into those group veg and things, but I wonder if you've looked at or mapped, or there's a way to identify which biophysical settings models might have classes within them that are also, like you mentioned the prairie example, sitting in another biophysical settings model. Is there a way to find that?
Great question. Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. we could do that. Is my kind of gut response, and I'm kind of vaguely seeing the process in my mind where we do have tables that have, you know, all the biophysical settings, their associated succession classes, and their kind of height, cover, life form, you know, herbaceous shrub or tree designations, and also the description. So yeah, that's a great question. And I think that we could do that. And wow, that's something I'll be thinking about and wanting to do. I wonder if others have done that. Yeah, and you see Louis' comment, a lot of elbow grease.
Yes, but kind of manually. And so if you know you have an understanding of all the systems in your area, you can make the links in your head. But if I had to do that manually with data, it would be a pain in the, I would have to, let's say I don't know the system, you have to audit all the class and somehow figure out from the descriptions of the class within the biophysicals that this class here is actually the same vegetation structure as an actual biophysical setting, you know, 500 miles away or something like that. And I just know in my head, but it's not something you can just get like that. You would have, your ecologist would have to tell you that. Like, this is most likely that system, and it's not an easy thing to do. So.
Further, I will add for anyone doing this work moving forward, I believe it was Greg Nowacki, an ecologist with Region 9 of the Forest Service. When he would describe his biophysical settings, he would put kind of monikers for the succession classes. So it would say prairie, savanna, woodland, you know, and he tried to be fairly consistent across the biophysical settings that he described and modeled. So for those few that he did, I would trust that I could just manually go and grab that based on his moniker, because he had kind of a framework for that. So moving forward, if you're doing this work, I would say it would be, you know, if you could be more consistent than we were able to be, that would help with addressing questions like Anna's.